The dusty stagecoach rolled into Copper Creek, Montana Territory on a hot Tuesday morning in July 1885. The wheels creaked and groaned as they came to a stop in front of the general store, kicking up a cloud of dirt that hung in the still air like a promise of trouble. Thomas McKenna stood waiting on the wooden sidewalk, his best hat in his hands and his heart beating faster than it had in years. Today was the day his mail-order bride would arrive. Today, his lonely life on the ranch would finally change. But when the stagecoach door swung open, Thomas knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The woman who stepped down wasn't the confident, smiling bride he'd imagined from her letters. Instead, a young woman in a torn white wedding dress stumbled onto the dusty street, tears streaming down her face like rain on a window. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung around her shoulders in tangled waves. She clutched a crumpled letter in one hand and pressed the other against her chest as if trying to hold her heart inside. Thomas had never seen anyone look so scared and broken in his entire 32 years of living. This couldn't be Eleanor Hamilton, the schoolteacher from Boston who had written him such proper, cheerful letters about wanting a new life out west. But she had to be, didn't she? She was wearing a wedding dress, and she'd come on the right stage at the right time. Maybe the journey had been harder than expected. Maybe something bad had happened along the way. He stepped forward slowly, like he would approach a frightened horse. "Miss Eleanor," he said gently, "I'm Thomas McKenna. I've been waiting for you." The young woman's head snapped up, and Thomas found himself looking into the most beautiful green eyes he'd ever seen. But they were filled with such terror that it made his chest ache. She stared at him for a long moment, her lips trembling, and then she whispered the words that would change everything. "Please," she said, her voice barely louder than the wind. "Please don't send me back. They'll kill me if you send me back." Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Kill her? What kind of monster would want to hurt someone so young and fragile? He looked closer at her torn dress and noticed bruises on her wrists, fading but still visible like ugly yellow flowers on her pale skin. Whatever had happened to her, it had been bad. Real bad. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady and calm, even though his heart was racing. "I don't know what's happened to you, but nobody's sending you anywhere you don't want to go. Not while I'm standing here." The relief that washed over her face was like watching the sun come out after a terrible storm. She sagged against the side of the stagecoach, and Thomas was afraid she might faint right there in the street. He quickly moved to her side and offered his arm. "Let me help you," he said. "My wagon's right over here. You need to get out of this heat and have some water." As they walked slowly toward his wagon, Thomas's mind was spinning with questions. Who was she really? What had she been running from? And why was she wearing a wedding dress that looked like someone had tried to tear it right off her body? But he didn't ask any of those questions. Right now, she needed safety and kindness, not an interrogation. The truth was, even though this woman wasn't the Eleanor Hamilton he'd been expecting, Thomas found himself drawn to her in a way that surprised him. There was something about her courage that impressed him. Despite being scared out of her mind, she'd still had the strength to run away from whatever had been hurting her. That took guts. What Thomas didn't know was that the woman beside him wasn't Eleanor Hamilton at all. Her real name was Mary Catherine O'Brien, and she was 19 years old with a story that would break your heart. She'd grown up poor in Boston, the daughter of Irish immigrants who died when she was just 16. With no family and no money, she'd been forced to live with a distant cousin who saw her as nothing more than a burden. When Cornelius Blackwood, a wealthy but cruel man in his 50s, had offered to marry her and pay off her cousin's debts, Mary had no choice but to agree. But on their wedding day, she'd realized just how evil Blackwood really was. The way he looked at her, the way he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks, the way he talked about owning her like she was a piece of property. It all told her that marriage to him would be a living hell. So when a minister had asked if anyone objected to the marriage, Mary had objected herself. She tore her dress, getting away from Blackwood's grabbing hands, and run straight to the train station with nothing but the clothes on her back and a few coins she'd stolen from her cousin's purse. She bought a ticket west, not caring where she ended up as long as it was far from Boston and far from Cornelius Blackwood. She'd hidden in the stagecoach for 3 days, sneaking food and water when she could, until they'd reached Copper Creek. When she'd seen Thomas standing there waiting for someone, she'd realized he must be expecting a mail-order bride. In that moment, with nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to, she made a desperate decision. She pretended to be whoever he was waiting for, at least until she could figure out what to do next. Now, sitting beside him in his wagon as they headed toward his ranch, Mary felt guilty about the lie, but also grateful beyond words. Thomas McKenna seemed like a good man. He hadn't asked her a single question that made her uncomfortable. He hadn't tried to touch her or demand explanations. He'd simply offered her protection and kindness when she needed it most. "My ranch is about 3 miles out of town," Thomas said as they bumped along the dusty road. "It's not fancy, but it's comfortable. I've got a room all ready for you, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, has been cooking for 2 days straight. She's excited to have another woman around the place." Mary nodded, not trusting her voice. She was already regretting the deception, but what choice did she have? If she told him the truth, that she wasn't Eleanor, that she was a runaway bride with nothing to her name, he'd probably turn her over to the sheriff. And the sheriff might send her back to Boston, back to Blackwood, back to a fate worse than death. "Thank you," she finally managed to whisper. "You're very kind." Thomas glanced over at her and smiled, and Mary felt something flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. He had kind brown eyes and laugh lines at the corners that told her he was a man who found joy in life. His hands on the reins were gentle but sure, and when he'd helped her into the wagon, he'd been careful not to touch her any more than necessary. "We'll have you feeling better in no time," he said. "Whatever happened to you before, it's over now. You're safe here." As they pulled up to a neat ranch house with flower boxes under the windows and a porch swing that looked perfect for watching sunsets, Mary felt tears start again. But these weren't tears of fear or desperation. These were tears of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she found a place where she could start over. Maybe Thomas McKenna was exactly the kind of man she'd always dreamed of but never thought she'd be lucky enough to meet. But as Thomas helped her down from the wagon and led her toward the house, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that her past wasn't done with her yet. Somewhere back in Boston, Cornelius Blackwood was probably looking for her. And when he found out where she'd gone, he'd come after her. Men like him always did. The question was, would Thomas still want to protect her when he learned the truth about who she really was? The McKenna Ranch house was nothing like Mary had expected. Back in Boston, the wealthy men she'd known lived in cold, fancy houses that felt more like museums than homes. But Thomas's place was warm and welcoming, with handmade quilts on the chairs and the smell of fresh bread coming from the kitchen. Sunlight streamed through clean windows, and everywhere she looked, she saw signs of a man who took care of what was his. "Mrs. Patterson," Thomas called as they walked through the front door. "Our guest has arrived." A plump, motherly woman with gray hair and a flour-dusted apron appeared from the kitchen, her face bright with excitement. But when she saw Mary's torn dress and tear-stained face, her expression immediately changed to one of concern. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, rushing forward. "What happened to you?" "Thomas, this girl looks like she's been through a war. She's had a rough journey," Thomas said quietly, catching Mrs. Patterson's eye in a way that told her not to ask too many questions. "She needs rest and some gentle care." Mary felt overwhelmed by their kindness. In Boston, people had always wanted something from her, but these strangers were helping her without asking for anything in return. It made her deception feel even worse, but she didn't know how to tell the truth without losing the safety she'd found. "I've prepared the blue room for Miss Eleanor," Mrs. Patterson said, leading Mary down a hallway lined with family photographs. "It's got a nice view of the garden, and I put fresh flowers on the dresser this morning." The bedroom was lovely, with a comfortable bed covered in a blue and white quilt, a rocking chair by the window, and yes, a small vase of wildflowers that filled the room with a sweet scent. But what surprised Mary most was that Thomas had given her a room of her own. Most men who sent for mail-order brides expected them to share a bed immediately, whether the woman was ready or not. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," Thomas said from the doorway, his hat still in his hands. "Dinner's at 6, but Mrs. Patterson can bring you something earlier if you're hungry. And please, don't feel like you have to do anything but rest today. You've been through enough." After he left, Mary sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that was happening. Thomas McKenna was nothing like the men she'd known in Boston. He was gentle and respectful, asking nothing from her except the chance to help. But she was living a lie, pretending to be Eleanor Hamilton when she was really just Mary O'Brien, a runaway with nothing to her name. That evening at dinner, Mary learned more about the man who had offered her shelter. Thomas had inherited the ranch from his father 5 years ago, and he'd been running it by himself ever since. He raised cattle and horses, and for what she could see, he was good at it. The ranch was prosperous but not showy, successful but not greedy. "Tell me about yourself, Eleanor," he said as they ate Mrs. Patterson's delicious pot roast. "Your letters mentioned you were a schoolteacher in Boston. What made you want to come west?" Mary's heart skipped a beat. She knew nothing about Eleanor Hamilton or what she might have written in her letters. She had to think fast. "I wanted a fresh start," she said, which was certainly true. Boston felt too crowded, too full of memories I'd rather forget. Thomas nodded understandingly. "I know something about wanting to leave the past behind. After my father died, I thought about selling this place and starting over somewhere new. But then I realized that running away doesn't always solve your problems. Sometimes you have to stand and fight for what you want." His words hit Mary right in the heart. Wasn't that exactly what she was doing? Running away? But what else could she have done? Stayed in Boston and let Blackwood destroy her? As they continued talking, Mary found herself relaxing for the first time in days. Thomas was easy to talk to, with a gentle sense of humor and genuine interest in what she had to say. When she mentioned loving books, his face lit up. "I've got a whole shelf of them in the parlor," he said. "Help yourself to any of them. I don't get much time to read during the busy season, but I love a good story on winter evenings." The more time she spent with him, the more Mary realized how different he was from what she'd expected. His letters to Eleanor might have been formal and practical, but in person, Thomas was warm and funny. He told her stories about ranch life that made her laugh, and he listened to her opinions like they actually mattered. But Mary's peaceful evening was interrupted when Thomas mentioned something that made her blood run cold. "Oh, I almost forgot," he said as Mrs. Patterson cleared their plates. "I got a telegram today. Eleanor's trunk and the rest of her belongings will be arriving on Thursday's stage. The railroad had some kind of mix-up in Chicago, but everything should be here by the end of the week." Mary's stomach dropped. Thursday was only 2 days away. How could she explain why Eleanor Hamilton's belongings didn't belong to her? How long could she keep up this pretense before someone figured out she wasn't who she claimed to be? That night, as she lay in the comfortable bed that didn't belong to her, Mary stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what to do. Part of her wanted to tell Thomas the truth. He seemed like the kind of man who would understand, who might even help her find a way to start over honestly. But another part of her was terrified that he'd be angry about the deception and turn her out, leaving her with nowhere to go and no protection from the dangers that might be following her. The next day, Thomas gave her a tour of the ranch, and Mary found herself genuinely interested in everything he showed her. She'd never seen cattle up close before, and she was amazed by how much work went into running a place like this. Thomas seemed surprised by her enthusiasm. "You're not quite what I expected from your letters," he said with a smile as they watched a mare and her foal playing in the pasture. "You seemed more formal in your writing, but I like this version of you better." Mary's heart sank. Of course, she wasn't what he'd expected. She wasn't Eleanor Hamilton at all, but his words also gave her hope. if he liked the real Mary better than the formal Eleanor. Maybe there was a chance he'd understand when she finally told him the truth. That afternoon, while Thomas was working with his men to repair a fence, Mary helped Mrs. Patterson with the washing. The older woman had been watching her carefully since she'd arrived, and Mary could tell she had questions. "Thomas is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said as they hung sheets on the line. "He's been lonely since his father passed. He deserves someone who'll appreciate what he has to offer." "He seems very kind," Mary agreed, feeling guilty about the deception. "He is, but he's also not stupid," Mrs. Patterson said, giving Mary a meaningful look. "He can tell when someone's not being entirely honest with him. Whatever's troubling you, child, you might want to consider talking to him about it. He's better at solving problems than most folks realize." Before Mary could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching fast. Thomas dropped his tools and walked quickly toward the house, his hand moving instinctively to the gun on his hip. Mary's heart started pounding as she remembered her fear that Blackwood might come looking for her. But it wasn't Blackwood. It was the town sheriff, Amos Riley, and he looked worried. "Thomas," the sheriff called as he dismounted, "I need to ask you something. You heard anything about a missing girl from back east? Irish girl, about 19, dark hair? Her family's been asking around, saying she ran off from her wedding in Boston." Mary felt the blood drain from her face. Her family? She didn't have any family left. That meant Blackwood was looking for her, probably claiming to be her concerned husband or fiancé. "Can't say I have," Thomas replied evenly, but Mary saw him glance in her direction. "Why? She in some kind of trouble?" "Don't rightly know," the sheriff said. "Got a telegram from Boston asking me to keep an eye out. Apparently, she's supposed to be married to some important businessman, and he's worried sick about her." Important businessman. Mary almost laughed bitterly. That's probably how Blackwood had described himself to the authorities. A concerned fiancé looking for his runaway bride, not a cruel man who tried to buy her like a piece of property. After the sheriff left, Thomas walked slowly back to where Mary stood frozen by the clothesline. He studied her face for a long moment, and she could see the questions in his eyes. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "is there something you need to tell me?" Mary opened her mouth to confess everything, but the words wouldn't come. She was too scared, too ashamed, too afraid of losing the first safe place she'd found in years. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered. Thomas nodded slowly, but she could see he didn't believe her. "All right," he said, "but if you're in some kind of trouble, I want you to know you can trust me. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together." That night, Mary barely slept. She knew Thomas was starting to suspect the truth, and she knew the real Eleanor's belongings would arrive in just one more day. Her time was running out, and she still didn't know what she was going to do. But as she listened to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, Mary realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling in love with Thomas McKenna, not because he was her ticket to safety, but because he was everything a good man should be: kind, strong, honest, and gentle. The question was, when he learned the truth about her, would he still be willing to protect her? Or would her deception cost her the first real love she'd ever known? Thursday morning arrived gray and cloudy, with the smell of rain in the air that matched Mary's dark mood. She barely touched her breakfast, and every sound from outside made her jump. Today was the day Eleanor Hamilton's belongings would arrive on the afternoon stage. Today was the day her whole world would come crashing down. Thomas had been quiet at breakfast too, watching her with those kind brown eyes that seemed to see right through her lies. Mrs. Patterson kept shooting worried glances between them, clearly sensing the tension in the air. The comfortable peace of the last 2 days felt like it had happened in a dream. "I need to ride into town this morning," Thomas said as he pushed back from the table. "Some business at the bank. Would you like to come along, Eleanor? Or would you prefer to rest here?" Mary's throat felt tight. "I think I'll stay here if that's all right." He nodded, but she could see disappointment in his face. Or maybe it was suspicion. She wasn't sure anymore. After Thomas left, Mary paced around the house like a caged animal. She tried to read one of his books, but the words swam in front of her eyes. She tried to help Mrs. Patterson with the cooking, but her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped a whole bowl of eggs. Finally, the older woman put a gentle hand on her arm. "Child, your wound tighter than a clock spring," she said. "Whatever's eating at you, it's not going to get better by worrying yourself sick." Before Mary could answer, they heard the rumble of wheels and the sound of multiple horses coming up the ranch road. But it wasn't Thomas returning alone. Through the window, Mary could see the afternoon stagecoach, accompanied by Thomas on his horse and another rider she didn't recognize. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw who stepped down from the coach. The woman was everything Mary wasn't: tall, elegant, dressed in a perfect traveling outfit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Her blonde hair was arranged in a fashionable style that hadn't been mussed by days of travel, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never known real fear or desperation. This was clearly a lady, born and raised, educated and refined. This was Eleanor Hamilton. Mary felt sick to her stomach as she watched Thomas help the real Eleanor down from a stagecoach. Even from a distance, she could see his confusion. Eleanor was beautiful, sophisticated, and exactly what he'd probably expected in a mail-order bride. She was everything Mary wasn't, and everything she could never be. "Oh my," Mrs. Patterson breathed, standing beside Mary at the window. "I think we've got ourselves a problem." Mary's legs felt weak as the group walked toward the house. Thomas looked stunned, glancing back and forth between the approaching Eleanor and the house where he knew Mary was waiting. The stagecoach driver was unloading several expensive trunks, while Eleanor chatted easily with Thomas as if she belonged here. When they reached the front porch, Mary could hear Eleanor's cultured voice through the door. "I do apologize for the delay, Mr. McKenna," she was saying. "The railroad mix-up in Chicago was absolutely dreadful, and then I had to wait 2 extra days for a stage connection. I hope you received my telegram explaining the situation." Thomas's voice was carefully controlled. "Actually, Miss Hamilton, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The front door opened, and Eleanor walked into the house with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her welcome anywhere. She was even more beautiful up close, with perfect skin and intelligent blue eyes that took in everything around her. When she saw Mary standing frozen in the parlor, those eyes went wide with surprise. "Oh," Eleanor said, looking back and forth between Mary and Thomas. "I wasn't aware you had other guests, Mr. McKenna." Thomas removed his hat slowly, his face grave. "Miss Eleanor Hamilton, I'd like you to meet—" "Well, that's the problem. For the past 3 days, I've been under the impression that this young lady was you." The silence that followed was deafening. Mary felt like she couldn't breathe as Eleanor's intelligent gaze fixed on her, taking in her simple dress, her nervous hands, her guilty expression. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was ice cold. "I beg your pardon?" "She arrived on Tuesday's stage," Thomas continued, his voice steady but strained. "Dress, wearing a torn wedding dress. She never actually said she was Eleanor Hamilton, but I assumed, and she didn't correct me." Eleanor's face went through several emotions: surprise, anger, and then a kind of cold fury that made Mary want to disappear into the floor. "Are you telling me," Eleanor said slowly, "that this person has been impersonating me? Living in my room, eating at my table, pretending to be your intended bride?" "It's not like that." Mary finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to what?" Eleanor snapped. "Didn't mean to lie and cheat and steal another woman's life? Didn't mean to deceive a good man who was expecting his promised bride?" Thomas held up a hand. "Now hold on, Miss Hamilton. Let's all take a breath here." But Eleanor was just getting started. She drew herself up to her full height and looked at Mary like she was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "What's your real name?" she demanded. Mary's voice was so quiet they could barely hear her. "Mary Catherine O'Brien." "And where are you from, Miss O'Brien?" Boston. Eleanor's eyebrows shot up. Boston? You're from my own city, and you thought you could get away with this charade? What possible reason could you have for such deception? Mary looked desperately at Thomas, but his face was unreadable. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the sense of betrayal, and it cut her deeper than any of Eleanor's sharp words. I was running away, Mary said, tears starting to spill down her cheeks, from a man who was trying to force me into marriage. A cruel man named Cornelius Blackwood. When I saw Mr. McKenna waiting at the stage, I thought, I hoped. You hoped to steal another woman's future, Eleanor finished coldly. How convenient for you. It wasn't like that. Mary cried. I was scared and alone and had nowhere else to go. I didn't plan this, it just happened. Thomas had been silent through this exchange, but now he stepped forward. Mary could see him struggling with his emotions, disappointment, anger, hurt, and something else she couldn't quite identify. So the sheriff was right, he said quietly. You are the missing Irish girl for Boston, the one whose family is looking for her. I don't have any family left, Mary said desperately. That's Blackwood looking for me. He's telling people he's my concerned fiancé, but he's not. He tried to buy me from my cousin like I was cattle. When I ran from the wedding, he swore he'd find me and drag me back. Eleanor made a disgusted sound. Even if that's true, it doesn't excuse what you've done here. You've lied to everyone, taken advantage of Mr. McKenna's kindness, and stole my place. I demand that you call the sheriff immediately, Thomas, and have this woman arrested for fraud. Mary's heart stopped. Arrested? If they arrested her, they'd send her back to Boston. Back to Blackwood. Back to a living hell. Please, she whispered, looking at Thomas with all the desperation she felt. Please don't send me back to him. You don't understand what he's like, what he'll do to me. Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and Mary could see the war going on inside him. She had lied to him, deceived him, made him care for someone who didn't even exist. But she could also see that he remembered her fear, her torn dress, the bruises on her wrists that first day. Thomas, Eleanor said sharply, surely you're not considering protecting this fraud? She's made fools of us all. She deserves whatever consequences come from her actions. Maybe so, Thomas said slowly, but I've never sent a woman back to a man who had hurt her, and I'm not about to start now. Eleanor's face went red with anger. Are you serious? After what she's done, after she's lied and deceived you for days? Thomas looked at Eleanor, then back at Mary. When he spoke, his voice was tired but firm. Miss Hamilton, I'm sorry you've been inconvenienced. I'm sorry this situation has caused you distress. But I won't be the man who sends Mary O'Brien back to someone who might harm her. If that means you can't accept me as a husband, then I suppose our arrangement is over. Eleanor stared at him in shock. You're choosing her, this lying, deceitful creature, over your legal bride? I'm choosing not to be part of something that might get a young woman hurt or killed, Thomas replied. Beyond that, I'm not sure what I'm choosing yet. The silence stretched out like a hell breath. Mary felt dizzy with relief and terror at the same time. Thomas wasn't sending her back to Blackwood, but she could see the hurt and disappointment in his eyes. Eleanor was right. She had deceived him, lied to him, made him care for someone who didn't exist. Eleanor gathered her dignity around herself like a cloak. Very well, Mr. McKenna. I can see where your priorities lie. I'll be taking the next stage back east, and I'll be sure to let everyone know exactly what kind of man you are. That's your right, Thomas said quietly. As Eleanor swept toward the door, she turned back one last time. You'll regret this, she said to Thomas. And you, she pointed at Mary, will get exactly what you deserve. After Eleanor left away for the next eastbound stage, the house felt empty and cold. Thomas stood in the middle of the parlor, his hat still in his hands, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. I suppose I should ask, he said without looking at Mary, is anything you told me the truth? Anything at all? Mary's heart broke at the pain in his voice. My feelings for you are true, she whispered. Everything I felt these past few days, every moment of happiness, every Every time I thought about what it would be like to really be your wife. That was all real. Thomas finally looked at her, and she could see tears in his eyes. But Mary Catherine O'Brien isn't who I thought I was falling in love with, is she? He said. She's not the woman who laughed at my stories and helped with the ranch work and made me think maybe I didn't have to be alone anymore. Yes, she is, Mary said desperately. I am. That was me, the real me. More real than I've ever been allowed to be before. Before Thomas could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching again. But this time, there were more of them, and they were moving fast. Thomas moved quickly to the window and cursed under his breath. Who is it? Mary asked, though she already feared she knew. Thomas's face was grim as he reached for his rifle. 3 riders, and unless I'm mistaken, one of them matches the description the sheriff gave of a certain businessman from Boston. Mary's blood turned to ice. Cornelius Blackwood had found her. The 3 riders approached the house slowly, like predators sizing up their prey. Thomas kept his rifle ready as he watched them through the window, and Mary felt her whole body start shaking when she saw the man in the middle. Cornelius Blackwood looked exactly like the nightmare she remembered, tall, well-dressed, with cold gray eyes and a smile that never reached them. Even from a distance, she could see the cruel twist of his mouth that had haunted her dreams. The 2 men riding with him looked like hired guns, the kind of men who did ugly work for good money. Mary Catherine, Blackwood called out as they stopped in front of the house. I know you're in there, my dear. Come out and stop this foolishness. It's time to come home to your husband. Thomas looked at Mary sharply. Husband? He's not my husband, Mary whispered frantically. The wedding wasn't finished. I ran before the minister could complete the ceremony. Blackwood's voice grew louder and more threatening. McKenna, I know you've got my wife in there. Send her out now, or we'll come in and get her. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. You're on my property, mister, and you're not welcome. Turn around and ride out. Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your property? That woman belongs to me. I've got the marriage certificate right here in my pocket. From what I hear, that certificate isn't worth the paper it's printed on, Thomas replied steadily. One of Blackwood's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. Boss, want me to? Not yet, Blackwood cut him off. Then he smiled at Thomas with false friendliness. Mr. McKenna, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Mary Catherine is my legal wife, and she's not well. She gets confused sometimes, tells stories that aren't true. I'm just trying to bring her home where she can get the help she needs. Mary stepped out onto the porch beside Thomas, her chin raised despite her fear. I'm not confused, and I'm not sick, and I'm not your wife. Blackwood's mask of politeness slipped, and for a moment, Mary saw the real monster underneath. You signed the papers, Mary Catherine. You spoke the vows. In the eyes of God and the law, you belong to me. She ran from that ceremony, Thomas said firmly. That makes your claim invalid. Does it? Blackwood pulled out an official-looking document. This says otherwise, and I've got the sheriff's support to take her back to Boston where she belongs. As if summoned by his words, Sheriff Riley rode up with 2 deputies. Mary's heart sank when she saw that the sheriff looked uncomfortable but determined. Thomas, Sheriff Riley said, I'm sorry, but Mr. Blackwood's got legal papers. Says this woman is his wife, and she ran off in a fit of hysteria. I have to take her into custody and send her back to Boston. No. Mary grabbed Thomas's arm. Please don't let them take me. You don't know what he's like, what he'll do to me. Thomas looked down at her terrified face, then back at the sheriff. Amos, you've known me for 10 years. Have I ever lied to you? No, Thomas, you haven't. Then believe me when I tell you that this man is dangerous. Mary came here beaten and terrified, running for her life. If you send her back with him, you might as well put a gun to her head yourself. Blackwood's voice turned icy. Are you calling me a liar, McKenna? I'm calling you what you are, Thomas said, stepping protectively in front of Mary. A man who thinks he can buy a woman like cattle and treat her however he wants. The tension in the yard was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mary could see the sheriff wrestling with his conscience, while Blackwood's hired men looked ready for trouble. Then Thomas did something that changed everything. He turned around to face Mary, ignoring the guns and the threats and the legal papers. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong enough for everyone to hear. "Mary Catherine O'Brien," he said, "you may have come here under false pretenses, and you may have lied about who you were. But in 3 days, I've seen more courage, more heart, and more genuine goodness in you than I've seen in most people in a lifetime." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold ring. "Blackwood, you can wave those papers all you want, but a forced ceremony isn't a marriage. Sheriff, I've got a legal right to protect my wife from a man who wants to hurt her." Mary's heart stopped. "Thomas, what are you?" "Mary Catherine O'Brien," Thomas said, his eyes locked on hers. "Will you marry me? Right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses? Will you be my wife, truly and freely, because you choose to be?" The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Mary stared into Thomas's kind brown eyes and saw everything she'd ever dreamed of: safety, love, a man who would fight for her no matter what the cost. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, I'll marry you." Sheriff Riley cleared his throat. "Well, I reckon I can perform a wedding ceremony right here and now, if both parties are willing." Blackwood's face turned purple with rage. "This is ridiculous. She's already married to me." "No," Mary said, finding her voice and her strength. "I was never married to you. I was sold to you. There's a difference." As the sheriff began the simple ceremony, Mary felt tears of joy replace her tears of fear. She was finally free to choose her own destiny, and she was choosing love. Sheriff Riley opened his worn Bible and cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." "This is insane," Blackwood shouted, spurring his horse forward. "I won't let you steal my property." But before anyone could react, the thunder of more horses filled the air. A new rider appeared over the hill, moving fast and wearing a silver badge that caught the sunlight. Behind him rode 3 more men, all armed and official-looking. "U.S. Marshal Johnson," the lead rider announced as he pulled up. "And I believe you're Cornelius Blackwood." Blackwood's face went white. "Marshal? What's the meaning of this?" Marshal Johnson dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "Been tracking you across 3 territories, Blackwood. You're wanted for fraud, extortion, and forcing underage girls into marriage. That little operation you've been running in Boston came to our attention." Mary felt her knees go weak with relief. The mysterious rider she'd seen watching the ranch. It had been the marshal following Blackwood's trail. "This is ridiculous," Blackwood blustered. "I'm a respectable businessman. This woman is my legal wife, and I'm simply trying to bring her home." "No, sir," Marshal Johnson said firmly. "We got testimony from 3 other young women who escaped your forced marriages. Turns out buying desperate girls from their relatives and forcing them through fake ceremonies is illegal, even if you do have fancy papers." One of Blackwood's hired men started reaching for his gun, but the marshal's deputies were faster. Within seconds, both men were disarmed and on the ground. "Mary Catherine O'Brien," the marshal said gently, "you're free, miss. Any marriage ceremony involving this man is invalid. He's got warrants in 4 states." Thomas squeezed Mary's hand. "Did you hear that? You're truly free." Blackwood made one last desperate play. "You can't prove anything. Those other women are liars, just like this one." "Actually, we can prove quite a lot," Marshal Johnson said, pulling out his own set of papers. "We've got bank records showing you paid Mary's cousin $50 for her. We've got witness statements from the church where you tried to force the ceremony. And we've got 3 other victims ready to testify against you." As the deputies put chains on Blackwood, he turned to Mary with pure hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over, girl. I'll find you again." Thomas stepped forward, his jaw set. "No, you won't, because you'll be in prison where you belong." Marshal Johnson nodded. 20 years minimum, if I have my say, maybe more. As they loaded Blackwood into the prison wagon, Mary felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she'd been carrying for months. For the first time since her parents died, she was truly free. Sheriff Riley cleared his throat again. Well, now that's settled, should we get back to this wedding? Thomas turned to Mary, his eyes soft with concern. Mary, you don't have to marry me just for protection anymore. You're safe now. You can choose whatever life you want. Mary looked at this good, kind man who had risked everything to protect her. Thomas McKenna, I'm not marrying you for protection. I'm marrying you because I love you, because you saw the real me and chose to fight for her. Thomas smiled, and Mary felt her heart melt all over again. Then let's do this right. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Mrs. Patterson appeared with wildflowers for Mary's hair. Some of the ranch hands gathered around as witnesses. When Sheriff Riley pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed Mary gently, like she was precious and fragile and worth everything. Well, Mrs. McKenna, Thomas said against her lips, ready to start our real life together. Mary laughed through her happy tears. I've been ready since the day you said nobody was sending me anywhere I didn't want to go. As the crowd celebrated around them, Mary caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance. Eleanor Hamilton stood by the stagecoach, her bags packed for her journey back east. For a moment, their eyes met across the yard. To Mary's surprise, Eleanor nodded once, not with friendship, but with a grudging respect. Then she climbed into the coach and was gone. Any regrets? Thomas asked, following Mary's gaze. Mary looked at her new husband, at the ranch that would be her home, at the people who had welcomed her despite everything. Not a single one, she said. This is exactly where I belong. The celebration that followed their impromptu wedding was the happiest day of Mary's life. Mrs. Patterson had somehow produced a feast from thin air, and the whole town seemed to appear as word spread about the dramatic events at the McKenna Ranch. Even the preacher arrived to give his blessing to the union the sheriff had performed. As the sun set over the Montana hills, Mary stood on the porch in her simple dress, no longer torn, but mended with loving hands, and watched her new husband talking with their neighbors. Thomas caught her eye and smiled, and Mary felt her heart skip the same way it had that first day when he'd promised to protect her. Having second thoughts, Mrs. McKenna, he asked, walking over to join her. Just thinking how different everything is from a week ago, Mary replied, leaning into his warmth. A week ago, I was running in terror. Now I'm married to the kindest man in Montana territory. Thomas wrapped his arms around her. A week ago, I was the loneliest man in Montana territory. Now I've got a wife who makes me laugh, helps with the ranch work, and is braver than any person I've ever known. As their guests began to drift away, promising to return soon for a proper celebration, Mary and Thomas found themselves alone on the porch swing, watching the stars come out one by one. Thomas, Mary said softly, there's something I need you to know. When I first came here, I was just trying to survive. But somewhere in these past few days, I stopped pretending to be someone else and started being myself for the first time in years. The woman you fell in love with, that's really me. Thomas took her hand and squeezed it gently. Mary, you came to me crying, thinking you were living a lie. But you were living the truest thing I've ever known. Real love worth fighting for. I promise to protect not just your safety, but your right to be exactly who you are for the rest of our lives. 1 year later, the spring morning was warm and bright as Mary McKenna stood in her garden, one hand on her growing belly and the other shading her eyes as she watched the road. Thomas had ridden into town for supplies, and she was expecting him back any minute. The ranch had flourished under their joint care. Mary's suggestions had improved their cattle operation, and Thomas's gentle guidance had helped her become confident in her new role as a rancher's wife. More importantly, they had built a marriage based on truth, trust, and genuine love. When she heard the familiar sound of wagon wheels, Mary smiled and walked toward the road. But Thomas wasn't alone. A young woman sat beside him on the wagon seat, clutching a carpet bag and looking terrified. "Mary," Thomas called as he helped the woman down. "This is Sarah. She came in on today's stage, running from some trouble back east. Thought maybe she could use a safe place to stay for a while." Mary looked at the frightened girl, probably no more than 18, with desperate eyes and clothes that had seen better days, and saw herself a year ago. Without hesitation, she walked forward and took the girl's trembling hands in her own. "Sarah," she said gently, "nobody's going to hurt you here. You're safe now." As Thomas unloaded Sarah's meager belongings, he caught Mary's eye and smiled. Some folks might call it coincidence that another desperate soul had found their way to the McKenna Ranch, but he knew better. Love had a way of multiplying itself, creating safe harbors for those brave enough to believe in second chances. That evening, as Mary watched Sarah eat her first peaceful meal in who knew how long, she thought about how much her life had changed. She'd come to this place as a fraud and a liar, running from a nightmare. Now she was Mrs. Thomas McKenna, respected member of the community, and soon to be a mother. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, settling beside her after Sarah had gone to bed. "Just remembering," Mary said, resting her head on his shoulder. "You saved my life that day, you know." "No," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We save each other." Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Mary closed her eyes and smiled, finally understanding what it meant to be truly home.